objectives of this conference are: one, exchanging ideas on the emerging peace and security dynamics and policy actions to strengthen state stability and development in Eastern Africa. We shall be exploring continental and region-centric conflict management models relevant to state stabilization in Eastern Africa. We shall be deliberating on the approaches to sustaining and accelerating policy research on state stabilization, peace and security interventions in Eastern Africa. And of course, we will try to open and advance further possibilities of mutual collaborations and partnerships, research, training, and publications.
A historic moment for GLOCEPS. And if you look at the theme of the conference, it inevitably underpins the closeness and complex of East African states, their experiences in the quest for sustainable peace and prosperity.
We are a fairly new think tank that is based here in Nairobi. We were founded in the year 2020 with an overarching vision of becoming a leading global center of excellence in action research, policy influence, and strategy formulation. We have since grown into a pioneer institution of excellence that provides a strategic link between experience and interdisciplinary research, policy formulation, and action. Our activities are underpinned by 5 pillars, as explained by the Associate Director. They include the defense and security pillar, diplomacy and foreign policy pillar, the development pillar, public policy, ethics and governance pillar, and the strategic interests and transnational clients pillar.
And environmental concerns in Africa and East Africa in particular. Ladies and gentlemen, the Eastern African region continues to witness the proliferation of terror groups and interstate conflicts. These conflicts emanate from questions of identity and belonging and a scramble for natural resources, while some of them are outrightly fueled by geopolitical entities. Most of these conflicts have been confined within states, creating state formation crises, governance deficits, and structural violence. This fragility has made Eastern Africa vulnerable to cross-border mobility of violent extremists, and transnational criminal networks who partake in trafficking of people, narcotics, and other resources.
Now, the issue in the northern part of the country is that there's a complex security environment, which makes it difficult to disarm locals within the area, and VEOs take advantage of this to move light weapons and small arms through. Next, we decided to look at VEOs and criminal gangs. Traditionally, organized criminals and VEOs are not linked together. This is because of the nature of their work. While criminal gangs are more undercover and are for profit, VEOs are in the business of terror, and mass terror at that. However, studies have shown that criminal gangs, especially juvenile gangs, have been identified as vulnerable groups to radicalization. This is because they run in the same spaces as terror groups and also suffer from poor social economic circumstances. So VEOs are drawn to them because they offer a communication channel through which they can recruit young members. But also, in turn, juvenile gangs are drawn to VEOs because they offer them the financial support and also the social support, because they give them reasons as to why legitimacy, as to why they have this tense relationship with social authorities, be it the police or the government. In DRC, we see a slight shift. These are not juvenile gangs now. We're dealing with more organized militia groups. For example, ADF. ADF was formed as an insurgency group, right? But now we see it is a pansurgency, having affiliated itself with IS. So this shows us that there's a danger of previously just criminal gangs moving their affiliation towards terror groups as it proves to be more lucrative or in some instances gives them a renewed purpose for their activities. Lastly, financing of terrorism. Here we look at 3 avenues. First, the hawala. The hawala is an informal banking system that is widely used within Africa and by immigrants who move money through mobile transfer, right? And it's very popular because it doesn't need the formalities that we have in other banking systems, and it's rather easy to move, especially to rural areas. Unfortunately, this system is not as regulated as it should be. Thus, VEOs take advantage of it and exploit this to send money in ways that they can't be traced. Second, we decided to look at digital currency and cryptocurrency in particular. Cryptocurrency is a digital currency financial transaction avenue. While it is not yet the main financing channel for terror groups, it is highly under-regulated and really we don't have a lot of information in terms of general information and just an understanding of how this system really functions. This means that it's vulnerable towards exploitation, especially if we allow for it to go under-regulated as it is, because it gives time instead for VEOs to learn how they can exploit this system. And there has been noted activity by IS and Al-Shabaab and their affiliates within cryptocurrency. Lastly, money laundering. The EAC has no joint measures to prevent money laundering. According to the a report by the Sentry, in South Sudan, proceeds of crime are laundered and invested within Kenya and Uganda, and after cleaned, they are used to then finance terror activities within these 2 states. Why is it so easy for money laundering to be prevalent within the region? National anti-money laundering, NAML, laws are divergent and characterized by enforcement deficiencies. This just means that the issue is not being dealt with in equilibrium across the different states. Now that we've looked at the different challenges that the EAC has, how do we envision an EAC member state, and what can they do to ensure that the planned center is effective? First, we call for harmonized national policies, which is lacking within the EAC. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen that the money laundering laws are not, the national anti-money laundering laws are divergent, right? So we need to ensure that such laws are being enforced across the board. This is key, and we saw in the EU example that for them, the key to that was getting a regional definition of what terror was, what can be considered a terror offense, and what is the resulting penalty. Second, we think that info sharing, especially intel, is key, not just among EAC members, but their partners. This would be Interpol, this could be other member states like Denmark, the States, any other member who helps us within this city joint effort. As we've said, terror is not just a transnational crime, but it's a global security threat. Third, reinforce the institutional framework. EAC is a long-standing institution, and we think that whatever supplements this center brings should add towards the existing institutional framework and not take away from it. Fourth, under victims, we are looking not just at the victims of terror attacks, but also returnees, who in this instance we will characterize as victims. First, we believe that they need psychosocial support because whether you have witnessed terror attack or have perpetrated it yourself, we believe that you deal with PTSD and different emotional and psychological frameworks that result from that. We also think that doctrinal reviews are key, especially with returnees, to offer them alternative narratives, positive narratives, and counter-narratives to the radicalization that they have undergone within these different VE groups. Lastly, we ask that there is a monitoring of emerging trends in VE and terrorism to encourage preemptive measures. We don't want to create policies that deal with situations that have already escalated. We think that it would be better to act on rather early on rather than do it later. For example, within cryptocurrency, as it's not a main channel yet, it would be better to catch and curb the system now than to wait until terror groups are there.
Between small arms operations, it's very complex. This thing is a complex thing that cannot be done by only states. It can be done by, it requires an integrated approach by all stakeholders. So all stakeholders should know their role. The media should know their role. The community should know their role. The government should know their role. We experts should know our role. It's a complex and multifaceted, and you cannot address it from one region. REXA alone cannot do it. The states cannot do it because you have got porous borders. You have seen from the previous presenter. States are embroiled in one, and multiple conflicts have lost the monopoly of use of force, lack of rule of law, ineffective border control, create a favorable environment for terrorists and governments alike. Enable terrorist organs to pursue their violence because of its availability, consolidating and expanding their power bases, indirectly to exert control on populations. So terrorism and counterterrorism are likened with small arms. They cannot do it without small arms. And that's why the small arms is a great concern in ensuring peace and security. And why? Let's ask ourselves 5 questions. One of the questions that you should ask: where were we? Where are we now? Where do you want to go? How do you go there, and when? 5 W's, and when do you go there? There's a problem. Nairobi Protocol was developed and entered into force in 2004 and entered into force in 2006. REXA was mandated to coordinate actions against small arms and weapons by implementing this. But the state parties have their role. The objective of this protocol was to prevent, eradicate, and combat small arms and weapons prolifications in the region. Was also aimed at promoting and facilitating information sharing, which is very critical for our regional regional aspect to address the issue of peace and security. Information sharing between the departments. It also to enhance the issue of cooperation at sub-regional and national levels. And it was also to ensure accountability of the government stocks, and also effective control and management of the small arms. So in this case, REXA has been coordinating a coordinator role. That is our mandate. And this one, REXA has done those things: formulation of control of small arms guidelines, and establishment of small arms control, national action plans, small arms legal ammunition, capacity building, among others. Best practices in practical disarmament, you can see a review of legislations. You can see them establish national focal points. The law here requires that every party state establish a national focal point. So national focal point is our entry point in any country of the 15 member states, the Horn of Africa, the Great Lakes, and the region. And the Ministry of Interior is our operational entry point. And also, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is administrative. So they were mandated to establish small arms national focal point, which are there, development of national practice plans, which is also a challenge, a very big challenge. Because they have got national plans, some of them are not reviewed, some of them are not implemented because of deficit, because of donor, because of money. The problem of money is everywhere, the source to implement this. Okay. I'm sorry, there was a problem. So, some of the initiatives are arms marking that have been going on in Eastern Africa, in Burundi, Rwanda, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, South Sudan, DRC. We have also had electronic record keeping software. There are a lot of challenges. One of them is the magnitude of the menace is too big for one state to do it. So it requires an integrated approach. All stakeholders must come on board. The media must come on board. The experts like you must come on board. the practitioners must come on board. So it is not only a regional problem, it is a global problem that must be tackled through ownership. You must own it. The process must be owned by the people, by the practitioners, by the stakeholders. And then at the same time, unpredictable short-term funding. Fundings are unpredictable. You cannot plan for it, like us as a region. Some shifting of donor interest. Sometimes a donor wants to only implement activities in Kenya, for example, or in Uganda, for example, or a section of the police, or maybe a section and leaving out. So this one requires, there's a problem, prevention of measures. Prevention measures are not given due attention by what they deserve. We talked about there is inadequate coordination among partners, some duplicating work, doing the same thing. If it is maybe building armories, containers, armory provisions, maybe capacity building, they're just concentrating that. They are not sensitized, going to sensitization, which is very important. Countries have not included the small arms control in their overall national development plans. They cannot get money if there's no, or if the SALWA issues is not put on board, then we cannot get money. Shifting priorities among development partners, lack of political will in some member states, not all, prolonged conflicts in the regions, the borders, porous borders, as talked about, that makes these things pass through, and also lack of appreciation of a nexus between security and development, where we expect the investors to see that without development, without peace and security, there's no development. And without the development, some peace cannot be there. So this nexus should come clearly, so that the investors should package their investment strategic orientations towards enhancing security and peace. By extension, the small arms issue is a critical element in this matter. And then incapacitated national coordination organs. The national focal points are incapacitated in terms of staff. Some have whatever even one. Some in terms of funding, in terms of equipment. Recommendations: enhance capacity of national commissions, strengthen continental and regional mechanisms on small arms and light weapons, enhance public education and awareness among communities and political class to enable ownership of the problem. This thing, political class, we are talking about the political will, the political commitment, political leadership is critical for the implementation of Nairobi Protocol.
I was in Juba last week to talk to the director of firearms under the CID in South Sudan. And I realized that for them, citizens are actually allowed to come in with their illicit arms and register it with the government. The government does not ask you, where did you get it? The government does not ask you, where do you get your ammunition? So that's a challenge to REXA.
The focus of states previously had been on issues of governance, poverty, disease, and internal security, which had continued to take center stage, much more broader than the strategic maritime issues. Gradually, a good example set by Kenya following the inaugural Nairobi Blue Economic Conference in 2018, awareness of the potential of the sector has been steadily rising, and the region has steadily improved its performance. The focus of this paper this morning is on littoral states within East Africa and issues surrounding the securing of their maritime interests. Some of these resources, for example, fish, are shared. Hence, maritime crimes and threats affecting them will be seen to be transboundary in nature. Maritime interests in the region, on the other hand, are common, such as defending critical maritime-related infrastructure, protecting and facilitating maritime trade, protecting sea lanes of communication, and maintaining freedom of navigation, safeguarding the ocean and maritime resources. But states continue to implement these strategies in isolation. The key concern, therefore, is a state's ability to safeguard these maritime interests for the overall benefit of its region and of its citizen and region at large. The problem statement that is before us this morning is that a cursory glance at the understanding of the importance of protecting maritime territories is that it is high within the region, and efforts being put in place have other spin-offs potentials. For example, boosting economic opportunities available now, known as the blue economy. Hence the need to safeguard this particular sector. There are diverse challenges that hamper this. For example, we've heard from previous speakers, matters smuggling, where we have arms, drugs, people, wildlife. We have sanctions, where flags owned by vessels that flag the region's flags contravene sanctions. We have spillover from conflict, as has been highlighted. There's an increase in illegal, unregulated, and unreported fishing. We have white-collar crimes in ports, some of it cyber. We have threats to offshore installations, as has been highlighted, matters Mozambique. We have environmental crime. We have the threat to safeguard our underwater cables. And we also have flag state issues, where flags that are used on board vessels could be violated. Questions that we should be asking, therefore, is whose responsibility is it to safeguard these maritime resources? In dealing with these threats and ensuring benefits accrue from exploitation of maritime resources, it is important to know that maritime security is no longer the sole prerogative of navies, as more non-military agencies are now involved. A national, regional, and international coordinated border security approach that incorporates all these entities is therefore vital in mitigating the threats identified. Why, you may ask? This is because maritime trafficking routes closely follow commercial shipping lanes, and modalities and technologies employed by criminals are more often advanced than those in legal trade. Criminal activity, especially illicit trade in narcotics, human, and weapons, has become so extensive that states and corporations may also be implicated in this criminal enterprise. The webs continue to be intricate. We have individuals involved who may be of different nationalities, for example. The vessels may be flagged to different states. Multiple vessels may be used in the network. The vessels may transit the water of various states and call at different ports before reaching the final destination. Despite the abundance of laws at the national level designed to combat illicit trafficking, you've heard matters small arms and CVE, an apparent impetus to stop specific types of crime, governments continue to remain marginally successful in preventing the flow of illegal trade. Ladies and gentlemen, based on the foregoing, what options are there for these East African states in securing their maritime interests, borders, in view of their obligations, both nationally, regionally, and internationally? You may ask, what obligations do we have? We are signatories to conventions, which in Kenya are law. What viable strategies exist or must be developed to assist? I posit that maritime domain awareness is key to achieving any coordinated action at sea. You cannot mitigate what you do not know. There is definitely a link between internal, which is the national capacity, and external, what you can contribute as a nation to regional or international initiatives. There is need to build national capacity to benefit and effectively contribute to regional and international initiatives in securing the littoral boundaries and addressing these maritime threats that adversely impact on harnessing these maritime interests. An observed challenge is the low institutional capacity for maritime security within states. This is characterized by overlapping mandates of agencies with a role in maritime security, the lack of adequate procedures for information exchange that is key and necessary to react to emerging situations, or insufficient resource allocation to combat maritime threats on land, as threats on land continue to take precedence. How do we overcome these challenges? I will use a case study of Kenya, which has continued to perform well in this area. In the case of Kenya, the country is endowed with a coastline of approximately 640 kilometers, inclusive of inlets and bays. The Republic of Kenya is focused on development of the interests. Much of what occurs in the vast maritime domain with respect to resource exploitation, vessel movements, activities, cargoes, intention, or ownership is often difficult to be known or to be discerned. Infrastructure and systems that span this maritime domain are limited or largely owned by the private sector and have increasingly become both targets of and potential conveyances for dangerous and illicit activities. This has led to Kenya's focus on a comprehensive national effort to enhance its national security by preventing hostile or illegal acts within its maritime domain. With the shift in focus, as you all know, to the blue economy and the desire for its optimal exploitation, came the realization that no single agency had a mandate to entirely safeguard Kenya's maritime assets and resources. Safe navigation of maritime traffic while ensuring maritime security, and also be able to uphold the state's maritime law and safety policy. There are multiple agencies in Kenya today with a role in maritime security. Most of these agencies also do not control sea power. They do not have direct responsibility for directing naval assets for actions at sea in combating maritime crimes. Hence, the adoption in Kenya of what we call today a whole-of-government approach to maritime security, where there is cooperation and collaboration between military forces and law enforcement organizations that possess this capacity and power to support the rule of law in countering transnational organized crime at sea. So with this realization, the next step was to build the national capacity. And you'll agree with me that a firm foundation lies in a strong public service, positions that citizens seek about having issues, and also maritime domain awareness, and having an all-encompassing security architecture that will safeguard the identified maritime interests. There's also need for enhanced civil-military security cooperation that is supported by legislation. This must include coast guards and equivalent national agencies. How did we do this? In 2014, we had the establishment of what we call a common border management security structure. We also operationalized what we call the Maritime Security Committee. We also established a multi-agency Coast Guard service, which is a one-stop maritime law enforcement agency. We're in the process of developing a national maritime risk register to identify and contextualize all these maritime interests, threats, and after that, it shall be followed by the drafting of a maritime security strategy. Thank you. So the focus is therefore on these shared responsibilities that will enhance and ensure the detection, the deterrence, the detection, the prevention, and the interdiction of individuals and organizations engaged in illegal cross-border activities. This coordination has enabled us to have intelligence sharing, the coordinated joint patrols, coordinated joint surveillance, and special operation interdictions. What have been our achievements? There's efficient delivery of service. It has created necessary conditions that allow the government ability to address strategic issues. We have seen the formation of what we call the Office of the Blue Economy. We've seen the role of the Kenya International Border Office. So we allow government to focus on strategic issues, and on the ground, the necessary conditions that allow the coordination of and ensuring maritime securities continue. It has led to common operations through the development of SOPs. It has strengthened national and regional coordination. For example, we do have a Maritime Joint Operations Center in Mombasa that is responsible for this. It has enabled the sharing and optimization of resources through sharing of resources such as vessel and surveillance equipment. What has this done? It has enabled us to safeguard our ocean, to detect, to prevent criminal and hostile activities. It has enabled us to protect critical maritime infrastructure and also expedite recovery. It has also enabled us to contribute more to regional and international objectives by being able to have objectives that enable us identify what we need to contribute at the regional levels. The lessons learned: for ease of coordination at the regional or international level, there is need to consider what we call national focal point. In Kenya today, we have the Kenya Coast Guard Service as a national focal point for maritime security, which has enabled the whole of government approach where agencies are able to get information at the same time because they are all represented within the Coast Guard. We also have increased commitments to legal frameworks, and we have seen also the importance of leadership where our own president continues to lead in matters blue economy by being a shepherd in some of the lead forums that talk about oceans. In conclusion, you'll agree with me that national capacity for maritime security will translate to regional capacities for the same. If you do not have the capability at the national level, you'll not be able to make contribution at the regional level, noting that all these issues that face us are transnational in nature. So any attempt at collaboration will only be meaningful when the initiatives look beyond the states with the aim of integrating all users of the sea, noting that much of what is out there is in the private hands. The challenge to maritime interests will continue to grow, and our responses, therefore, must continue to keep up. I thank you.
Now, the scholars have come up with 5 typologies of networks. Okay, so this again is, we all know about it. So we have a criminal network, okay, which is the traditional understanding of transnational organization, transnational organized crime, TOCs. So you have one individual, you know, it's highly rigid, one individual leading other members. But we also have the so-called standard rigid hierarchy, where you have a single leader and a defined hierarchy. So there's a little bit of similarities between the two. Then we have regional hierarchies. These are, you have a single boss, but he is highly decentralized. We have a clustered hierarchy, where we have a number of criminal groups with a strong autonomy. And lastly, we have what we call a core group, which is what we see today in the perpetration of TOCs, where you have loose networks with limited numbers of individuals. They don't have a very tight structure, and they're small in size. Yeah, so if you look at all TOCs, I think the typology number 5 explains TOCs today. So this is a fact. Okay, so this is a fact that, of course, there's the high correlation between globalization and TOCs. So the UNODC, in their work that they did in 2002, told us that. Okay? And also, that there is evidence that organized crime groups operate in more than one country. So that's the aspect of globalization. So that's a fact. We also know that a minority of groups are structured in a rigid hierarchical format, and hence my emphasis on the fifth network typology. So these are things we already know. So I pulled up these statistics. This is the regional mean score on composite organized crime index. It's a little bit old, but I just wanted to make a point that if you look at our region, basically we are faring the same as far as TOCs are concerned. So I picked South Asia. I picked regions that are a bit similar to us in a couple of ways, culture, governance, etc. So South Asia, North Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa that is closer. So why do we have these statistics? So it shows prevalence. Okay, so it shows prevalence. So why is that? So one of the reasons given for the prevalence is that there is weak institutional controls. Okay? And if you reflect to the police service, research has shown that police performance is highly correlated to proliferation or preference of TOCs. Okay. So in cases where there police officers are more professional, okay, there's a low or modest levels of TOCs. Okay. So here, the point I think is on institutional controls. So institutional controls is one of those medicines, perhaps. Now, how can we understand TOC networks? I talked about the typologies already. So there are two ways. Okay, there's the micro network, networks, and the macro networks. Now, research has focused on the micro networks. Okay, and the assumption that when it comes to the perpetration of TOCs, typology number one, if you recall what it was, and two are more true about it. And that's where now the focus can be placed in attempting to respond to TOCs. But recent literature shows that the macro network thesis is more true. Okay, and this refers to typology number 5, the last one, which is the core group, where you have macro networks that include a number of professionals. Okay, so this is not a joke. Okay, this is not the people who are just learning things. You find entrepreneurs, investors, you find technicians, accountants, and even lawyers like myself who are involved in this macro network. And hence why perhaps when we try to understand the perpetration of TOCs, perhaps typology number 5 should be the best choice of explaining how TOCs are perpetrated. But we also have to understand this other aspect called social networks. So what we are saying here, and what I'm saying is that we need to also try to understand TOCs in the context of social networks. So these are not just people who are attempting to commit crimes across borders, but also there are some sort of associates, okay, to the level of even family. They may be family friends. They may. So these are things that are important to understand in order for us to better understand understand approaches or devise approaches to respond to TLCs. But there's also this aspect of alien conspiracy, which is the perspective that perpetrators of TLC are foreigners or alien to ourselves. Okay, so this also research has shown that it's a fallacy. That it's not only perpetrators of TLC who are alien in nature, but they can also be social networks within the local environments.
I want to share some few facts and figures. Maritime counterterrorism is evolving. Research has been done, and when you study it in various books, you realize that what you know today, tomorrow you don't know it. It's highly evolving. And it's the nexus between security control from the sea to the land. I know our government has done a lot, particularly on land as well as sea. But because of uneven harmonization of regional policies and strategies, we realize that spillover of this crime is coming to our country because our regions are not having uniform application by the yardstick to control some of these crimes. The Indian Ocean is being rediscovered. Initially, it was known as a sea route for connecting Africa to Middle East, East Asia, and eventually Europe and America. But because of resources, there's competition. People are competing for resources. Indian Ocean is the third world ocean, covering around 7.56 million kilometers square, which is approximately 20% of water in the Earth's surface. Competition in these areas is because of resources, human, economic, and environmental issues, and now we see regional players are being drawn into focus. Why do we need to understand that if we don't take security of our waters, then our land is in jeopardy? As you all know, that 8 countries of African states are coastal states, means they have the access to the water. And some of those areas are porous areas whereby these crimes can have access to our mainland. We know that in East Africa, some initiatives have been undertaken. One which is border security, coastal security, enforcement strategies, counterterrorism financing. In the opening of counterterrorism center, there is something that our first presenter said that we need to ask ourselves: does all African states have national counterterrorism center? If they don't, then there's a problem, because you realize some of these functions in other countries are being undertaken by the police. So, and you realize that because of the evolving nature of these crimes, and when people are not trained, it really causes a very serious issue. So, we have reasons where our EAC countries are not secured. We have porous border bonds, proximity of Arabian Peninsula, the Arabian Sea, the proximity. Because of some of the terrorist activities that have been performed in the past, there has been more from some countries, which our earlier presenters have already spoken, and I don't want to delve on that. We have weak law enforcement and judicial institutions, and we are advocating that some of these institutions should be adequately given resources for purpose of law enforcement and judicial, for purpose of empowering the judicial institutions. There is pervasive corruption. This is whereby people are given money to allow those people to perpetuate their activities. And we seriously condemn this. We have some of the regional efforts that have been undertaken. We have African Integrated Maritime Strategy 2050 that talks that all African states must be secure so that they encourage equal development. But this strategy has not been duly implemented. In 2014, AU adopted Rome Charter on Maritime Security. This charter, in 2007, ministers met in Nigeria, and in 2009 they met in Japan, South Africa. Some of the shortcomings arising out of this is that this African Maritime Transport Charter failed in 1993 when necessary signatories were not realized. During AU ministers in 2007 in Nigeria and African Maritime Transport Charter in 2009. You see, as we develop strategy, we should look at the international strategies, regional strategies, and national strategies. So when our regional strategies are failing, what do we do with our national strategies? So the charter does not address illicit trafficking and IUU. That's a very serious issue. And then the charter was drafted by AU Commission for Energy and Infrastructure. This is research. I'm not just giving facts, but this is research that has been done. And then the charter carries broad aspirations and directives to member states, whereby you just speak and you don't give something that can create some policy discourse. Last but not least, what we need to do? We need to capacity build patrols both in land and sea. So if we focus more on land and we forget sea, sea is high to us because of capacity issues. There is need to seek international support and partnerships. We have seen this working before, and we can still believe that it can work for our region. There is one thing, finalizing addendums and non-binding instruments. Countries meet at EAC level. Some of the documents they are making, they need to be binding so that states are held or obligated for purpose of implementing. Then we need to have an encompassing regional approach. Then lastly, we need to put our regional interests first than personal interests. Lastly, strong leadership, political will to facilitate implementation, identifying common security concerns to ensure better and collaborative and corrective strategies in diverse implementation of environment. I want to end my comments. There is one commentator called Silas. He said, African history and its subsequent insecurity and lack of development is no excuse of poor governance. What is lacking is not proper commitment, but commensurate action and application.
Having looked at what my colleagues have presented and the enticing topics, there's something that we need to ask ourselves, particularly about leadership and governance. If you talk about radicalization, we came up with the county action plans. The question is, what about our leadership and governance? How are we approaching the whole idea of dealing with radicalized youth in the region? Why is it becoming a persistent problem every other day? Have we really gone to address the root cause? Or are we just using the hard methods to address the problem? That is something we need to really interrogate. The other one is on our investigative capacity. Do we have the capacity to investigate? you have the capacity for enforcement. Some of the emerging issues that you see are touching so much on prevailing problem that touches on our leadership and governance. Because when we talk about financial terrorism, on how this money, on financing of terrorism, how does this money trickle down to our economy? Where are our financial systems? How can we tie those loose ends that some of these transactions can be done in a manner that we are able to track the money? And we could be interested because if you talk about the other issue on issues of piracy, we know the challenge we've had with our waters in Somalia and the fact that all the big five have now set their accounts in Djibouti to protect their interest. The question would be, how are we going to take care of our interest and the influence from the Middle East as it comes through Djibouti and also in Somalia? Then the next thing will be looking at the big picture in terms of piracy, the challenge that also our waters are facing in terms of human trafficking, in terms of drugs, the persistent drugs that we are finding their way in our markets. How do they come in? The interesting thing is that almost all government agencies are working in silos. Yes, you are looking at me and worried, but I'm saying the truth. You find everybody's protective of that information, but we are working for the same government. So the question will be, if you actually share the information, if you work in harmony, then it will be easier for those who are working in maritime and those who are working on the land. There's that seamless sharing of information and timely response. That will actually address our big problem. Because the question will be, as a country where we are today, we have so many laws, we have got very many agencies, but the problem we are sitting here to discuss about same problems. What is the problem? That is something probably we need to really to look at it. And even further on it, if you consider, for example, from what the first presenter talked about this radicalized youth and all that, we actually get them arrested, take them to court, and take them to committee or whatever. Are we really rehabilitating them? Even the follow-up of those ones who are in committee or Naivasha, are we really rehabilitating them? And have we even gone further to investigate how the prisons have become centers of that radicalization? And then the issue of the technology. You mentioned, yes, the groups are also using technology. The question would be, then how are we able to curb that problem? These are issues that probably when we think about organized crime, then we need to think about how we need to address this big picture by ensuring that even the forms of rehabilitation, following all this to the logical conclusion that we rehabilitate these people in the right manner. But then it goes back again to the other concern, the hard methods that are being used by security agencies. The more you push, the harder they push, the more radicalized they become. Are we achieving it? The next one, I want to mention something about small arms and this proliferation of small arms. Interestingly, I tend to think it's by design that police are absent in some regions. By design. Because around 75% of police are concentrated in a particular area of the country. The rest of the area is actually left for us. Then you'll be asking the IG every day, why are people fighting? Why are people fighting? But there are no police officers there. This goes back to the issue of actually designing our strategies. What are appropriate strategies? Probably they will be more localized. My brother mentioned about Sudan where you go and register your illegal arm. I know here sometimes we were talking about, can you come and register yours? But in the first place, how did you acquire it before I even asked you to come and register? And then by the fact that I now have an illegal arm, and then you're telling me, fine, can you put it down so that we can protect you? And I find 2-3 days there's no police officer. Why would I not go for another one? It's an issue about design and strategy at the security level. There's something amiss. Because that's where we find a problem. Our politicians have almost all the protection around the clock. What about the ordinary Kenyan? That is something about leading to this issue of these arms. You have all borders border and you have no police. Why would I not go and get the arms for self-protection? This is something that we really need to interrogate, because we are somehow in this problem by designing it ourselves. And sometimes we sit in conferences and we discuss it, but we don't solve the problem. That is something we need to look at it critically. The other one I would like to mention is on our capacity. Every now and then we are talking about our capacity in terms of investigation, our capacity in terms of prosecution. How would we address these problems of capacity? And then we talk about inadequate budget, inadequate resources to finance our specific activities. Somehow we need to think through how do we work with the little resources to resolve the problem. And that can be done by seamless working of agencies. With that information sharing, so that we don't work in silos as different agencies. Then we exploit the information and the knowledge that we have to ensure that our region and our country is safe.
Briefly, why do we have upheavals? One of the most seminal works that I have read was Samuel Huntington's Crash of Civilizations and the Remaking of the World Order around 1986. And he said that future wars will not be fought between countries, but between cultures or civilizations. That was about 30 years ago. And we can now extrapolate that or see what is happening 30 years later. One of the big drivers of crashes or upheavals happens to be religion. For the last very many years, those of you who are Christians can remember the jihads and crusades 1,000 years ago. If you look at what has been happening in Lebanon, there's something religious in Yemen, and something religious in Russia. If you look at Chechnya, Ingushetia, they are basically very Muslim. Nigeria, you have seen what has been happening, and even Ireland. So religion is a very important part of culture. And of course, people fight because they come from different races, different tribes, or different clans. If you go to Sudan, you discover there's a mixture of that: religion, clan, race, and so on. But I've always argued that people can also have upheavals because of resources: oil, land, farming, water, and so on. If you look at the Middle East, a lot of oil. Congo, other minerals. And northern Kenya, land and lack of water. I was in Isiolo last weekend, and I was being told how conflicts disappear as soon as it rains, and the grass grows, and the pastures are abundant. But Huntington's thesis is counterbalanced by what is happening today. Ukraine and Russia are very culturally similar. If you look at Somalia, there's one language, there's one religion, but they still fight. And that brings in what Brigadier General Mohammed was saying. We need to look at the human factor. Can you imagine Kenya or Uganda fighting each other? I don't even think military strategies stimulate that, because it's very unlikely. We are so culturally similar. So those are some of the reasons that we have upheavals, and then let's look at them briefly. We start with Latin America, where we talk about, we know so much about football, but there are other causes of upheavals, particularly narcotics. But if you check deep, and somebody said it in the morning, it is not so much narcotics, but weak states that is causing that instability. And something that surprised me about South America, and politicians in this place should discover this or should see this. Those countries have been independent for 200 years. So don't imagine that as we celebrate more years of independence, things are going to improve. We must do our work. So Mexico and Colombia are famous for narcotics, and that has stunted economic growth, although they have been independent for a very long time. Somebody talked about that. You can see where drugs go from Central America. There's a very good gap. There's a very good arrow at the bottom showing South Africa. Maybe that eventually comes to Kenya, West Africa, to Europe, and so on. But most of the arrows are pointing to the north. Don't ask me why. And see what has been happening to the market for those drugs. And you may notice that very, very good growth, whether you're talking about opium or cocaine, a lot of that has been manufactured, has been produced. So those are some of the instabilities you have to think about. You may not talk Spanish, but what happens in Mexico, what happens in Colombia has an effect on what happens in this country. Because if we start getting drugs into this country, a lot of young people are affected. People focus their attention on non-productive sectors of the economy, we are going to be affected. And you can see the global trafficking flow of cocaine. You can see very big arrows from South America, other arrows to Europe and so on. So those events might be taken away very far away, but what happens there has an effect on our economy. We have talked about Russia, some talked about that. I've talked about Chechnya and Ingushetia. Anybody from Naivasha here? Naivasha? Kwani mnatoka wapi? Because there's a place in Naivasha called Chechnya. Nobody from Naivasha? You don't go vasharing? Or you're always on your phone, you don't see what's happening around you. I talked about Ukraine. Very surprising because Ukrainians and Russians are from Slavic background, same family, same language, same religion, but still fight. In Europe, upheavals have been the Balkans. Remember what happens after Broz Tito died? Religion again, Serbs are Orthodox, Croats are Roman Catholic. So behind the upheavals in the Balkans was a bit of religion. And those of you who followed what was happening in the Balkans, there was a very big component of religion. Catalonia, again, they feel they are making a lot of contribution to the Spanish economy without commensurate return. Ireland, you know about it. And of course, all these events, you are feeling it in your pocket. I was very surprised to go to the supermarket yesterday, and I found this oil on sale. I don't know whether anybody has bought it. Anybody has bought that cooking oil? The Brank? Watu wa Kibo, Cowboy, na vitu kama hizo, But if you check very closely at the bottom, that oil is actually from Ukraine. And I was wondering how it has suddenly become very common in Kenya amidst that. So we are feeling that. Whatever happens here, we feel it. I will be talking about integration later on. And something else that left me wondering, anybody here who is a member of AIPCA Church? AIPCA Church. Very strange group. You have never been to Naivasha. You don't know your church group. Because I discovered that the cross the AIPC Church uses is the same as the Russian Orthodox Church. I don't know who copied who, but that was quite surprising. We also talk about what we refer to as frozen conflicts. You can see what is happening in Russia. You can see Crimea there. You can see separatist-controlled Luhansk and Donetsk on the right. You can see Ossetia there, Abkhazia, Nagorno-Karabakh. All those are frozen conflicts, but are sources of upheavals. This was about 20 years ago. Now they are not frozen anymore. You know what is happening. Region in the UK, you can see the Protestants versus Catholics who are a bit on the far left side of Ireland. That's just for those of you who know that game. A few of you might be here. It appears I can get golfers this side. Those are people for darts was that side. If you look at upheavals in Asia, you know about what's happening in Syria, Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, Palestine and Israel, Afghanistan, a very strange place. Britons tried to take Afghanistan, they didn't. Russians tried, US tried, they have all given up. Do you know what has been happening in Burma? China and India, they have another frozen conflict. And you have to think about all those upheavals and how they affect your country. I talked about these frozen issues, I don't need to go back to that. Africa, I don't know what's happening in Nigeria. Wow, Africa's biggest economy. Somali, I talked about that. Sudan, Jano Subeyo, you are here. Congo, you know what has been happening in Mozambique. And Sahel, where we have been having Russian doing something that is unusual, sending mercenaries there. You know Ethiopia, Cameroon, Libya, and Kenya. Some regions of Kenya have not been very stable. So all those upheavals have an effect on your economy in one way or the other. Separatism is another issue we are worried about. All those African countries have an issue of separatism. If you look at Sahel, if you look at Western Sahara, if you look at Gambia, if you look at Nigeria, if you look at Agora, you look at Zambia, you look at DRC, you look at Somali, there are issues of separatism. But we have good news here about upheavals. We are having less conflicts. If you look at that diagram from World War II up to now, people are fighting less. There are less deaths. When we have less conflicts, as Owino said, now we have more trade. The connection between more trade, less conflicts. And you can see that's very good news. Another economic upheaval we cannot forget is Ukraine. And you can see what has happened to the refugees from Ukraine to other parts of Europe in millions. That has an effect. If you have been to Kakuma, if you have been to Dab, you know what we are talking about. And of course, the Ukraine is affecting you because of food and fuel prices. You cannot forget about upheaval from COVID-19, and hopefully nothing from small monkeypox. Another upheaval that has become very common is nationalism. You all remember Donald Trump and America First. That goes against the principles of globalization. Jobless and inflation are real consequences of that, and of course, refugees. And you can see now the real effect of upheavals that we are talking about. You can see what happens in Kenya around 1969, this is 1969, 1982, you can see the coup here, you can see the multi-party here, you can see the post-war violence here, and you can see COVID here. So all these upheavals have an effect on your economy. That's why we are thinking about them. And soon we shall talk about the effect on integration. Because when a country is thinking so much about itself, it cannot think about integrating with others. And you saw that during COVID-19. Refugees, you can see where they are moving. Kenya is affected, and you cannot ignore them. We cannot ignore another upheaval, which is called natural disasters. The ring of fire, the volcanoes in Asia, the hurricanes in Africa finally, the climatic changes. That is now we are all waiting for the rain now. But at this time every year we should be having rain. Pollution of rivers that cross across countries, drought, and of course floods, as we talk in South Africa. And we cannot talk another very important emotional upheavals. There might be no fighting here, but people are emotionally disturbed based on prejudice, stereotypes, history, and so on. You remember the case of racism in the US, or caste in India, or in Kenya, you can see this photo here, a golf course and a kibera on the other side. What do people on each side of that divide think about each other? And if you have been to South Africa, you must have been called Makwerewekere. That's a name, if you keep on pronouncing, you may have to go and see a dentist. A Makwerewekere is an African from outside South Africa. And of course, in Kenya, we have tribalism and stereotypes. So these are some emotional upheavals we must think about beyond people fighting, as we are used to. What are the implications for East African integration? I must confess that the founding fathers had a very good dream about Pan-Africanism, that Africa should be one, that Africa should talk as one. And I'm very happy that now we have new members of East African community, like Rwanda, Southern Sudan, Burundi, and later DRC. And you can see the aspiration remains the same: prosperous, competitive, secure, stable, and politically united East Africa. But the political will is lacking. I want to challenge you, I don't know whether you have any politician here. Have you had your MCA, senator, governor, DP, or president talking about East African community in their political rallies? If you get them talking about that, give me that recording. I'll buy you a drink of your choice, in a place of your choice, and in company of your choice. So if we have to prosper and have an integrated East African region, we must focus on our commonalities and reduce our differences. And some of the differences include different histories. Uganda had kingdoms we never had. I don't know how many of you know that in Kenya, central Kenya, we had a two-party system that kept on changing from one generation to the other. Who have we interacted with? That's a major factor in integration. In Kenya, we have had Chinese, Portuguese, Arabs, British, Indians, and Persians. Ugandans have not interacted like that. Congolese have not interacted like that, and that affects our perspectives. Differences in colonialism: do you fight for independence or you are given? Economic activities, ujamaa versus capitalism. We have to think about our culture. Like, I always find Tanzanians and Ugandans very humble people compared with the Kenyans. Kenyans are very assertive. That's why quite a number of Kenyans are looking for wives in Tanzania and in Uganda. And when I ask them, why are you getting a Ugandan or Tanzanian wife? Ladies have nothing against you. This is what they have told me.
You have 2 minutes.
I'm finishing. They tell me that wanawake wa Kenya wamepea pembe. We have to think about receptiveness to foreigners. Are we outward? And of course, class consciousness. What are our commonalities? Language, race, religion, aspirations, and trade. And I can capture this. If you look at this, one of the reasons why we are not integrated is because we do not interact enough. We don't have enough inter-country trade. It's very good that tourists are coming from neighboring countries, and we don't have enough mobility in terms of education. We don't go to other countries to study. We go to UK and India, but we don't go to neighboring countries. Maybe we don't buy enough. This is data for our trade with neighboring countries. This is the people who export to us. I talked about trade growing. I talked about the theory of trade, that you trade more with your neighbors. And if you trade more with your neighbors, you have no reason to have any conflicts with them. That's what we are saying that. I think I don't need to talk about that. I was just explaining the gravity theory of knowledge, and we talked about trade agreements. You can see we are not the only people who are coming up with the regional trading blocks. Other people came before us, and we need to follow their examples. So we need more institutions in East Africa to safeguard integration. This is what Europeans have done. I know we have courts, we have parliament, but we don't have a common currency, and we don't have a common East African university. We budget together. I don't know whether we have an East African brigade. We need more cultural interaction. And we need to learn from others, not just in terms of fashion and music. You can see this girl wearing the American flag. Why can't you wear a Ugandan flag or a Kenyan flag? So we need to not just copy what other people do. That is not important, but what is important. For example, do we have such institutions in East Africa? Do you have an East African Parliament, a Council for East Africa, a commission? Do you have a Court of Justice? Do you have a Court of Auditors? Do you have an East African Central Bank? Do we have an East African Ombudsman? Do we have External Action Service? Do we have a social committee? Do we have a committee of regions? Do we have an East African Investment Bank? And do we have a data protection officer? So if we have to integrate more, we have to come with institutions that are going to safeguard that. And remember that Europe went through upheavals before they integrated. But we don't need to go through upheavals to get integrated. We can learn from other people's experiences. Let me give you a few points to ponder. Do you think devolution has diluted East African integration? We want to integrate at the top, but at the bottom, we are devolving. Should we add Ethiopia and Somalia to East Africa, East African community? Somebody asked me, I'm just about to finish. Somebody asked me this morning, why is Somalia not part of East African community and is the most eastern country in Africa? I was very perplexed. How does East African dream and aspirations fit in East African free trade area and African Union Agenda 2063?
When I was asked to speak about this topic, the research problem or the puzzle was, while economic integration holds a lot of prospects in Africa, and especially in regard to the more ambitious African continent free trade area that has been proposed, of course, it is very prospective, but we have a lot of challenges. One of the challenges, for example, is that while we have those protocols, we have those instruments, but when it comes to implementation, we have a challenge of implementation. Now, somebody spoke in the morning and was saying it's about leadership and governance, and I agree. But in the course of this brief presentation, I'm hoping that you will understand why implementation is difficult. Because part of the reason why implementation is difficult, or the reason why institutions are weak in Africa and so on, is because they are designed that way. And again, for a particular, logic. So it's not like things are happening by chance. Now, if I was to connect with the presentation that came before me, when Professor was asking whether we have those institutions, the East African Parliament and so on and so forth in Europe. Well, I think actually that one of the reasons, and perhaps this will explain why we are likely or we are still facing the problem of economic integration, which ideally is supposed to progress into political integration, is largely because African countries did not actually go through the process of state formation. If you are to look into how European countries and boundaries came into being, it involved a lot of conflict, a lot of negotiation, and especially between the elite class and the people who are being ruled. So there was a lot of, kind of upheavals that we were being told here, a lot of fighting, to the extent that people said, okay, those who are governed are saying, okay, I will accept to be governed, and I will pay taxes for that matter. But those of us who will be governing us then, I will expect you to kind of have this responsibility. And so there was some kind of negotiation, something which many African countries, of course, did not go through because we know how our boundaries were actually drawn. So the African, while we are also talking about economic integration, first in East Africa, and of course, I'll be talking about the East African community in that regard. Maybe mention about IGAD, but I don't want to talk so much about IGAD because I think we've been talking about IGAD a lot, and IGAD is more of a development-oriented, economic community. But while we are talking about integration, it is also important that although we are getting very globalized, we are also getting very localized. So that there is this attempt to broaden the market, maybe have a single, a single market, make systems work, and so on and so forth, make free movement of goods and services easier. But at the same time, when it comes to the context of individual member states, the interests become localized. And perhaps that's why somebody was asking whether, actually it was Professor who just came before, he was asking whether our politicians will talk about the East African community in their political rallies. What will most likely come out more? You will see a lot of localization. Yes, we are in the East African community, but we shall be seeing in the following slides that we also have a lot of national interests. And because the actors in the global arena are actually individual member states, and these individual member states are actually supposed to be responsible to their citizens because it is the citizens who vote in government. So in most cases, you are likely to have a government that is responsive to the citizens and not necessarily to the economic bloc, whether you are talking about EAC, COMESA, IGAD, and so many others. Next slide, please. Okay, because I was told to reflect about history, I largely relied on existing literature. Next slide. Well, the theory that kind of informed my paper is political realism, where we are saying that it stresses competitive and conflictual interest of state as opposed to maybe collaboration or cooperation, where each individual member state, as much as they are joining, say, the East African community, COMESA or ECOWAS, or largely joining the African continental trade area, for example, each of those member states is kind of looking inwardly towards what are they going to benefit from this. And we shall be seeing shortly part of the reason why the East African community, which collapsed in 1977, maybe collapsed. The next slide. Well, if you look at that, we are talking about part of the lessons that we could learn from the collapse of the East African community. So that as we talk about economic integration now, perhaps we can borrow a few lessons from there. One, in the case of East African community, Kenya was accused of benefiting more. Well, I don't want to explain that, more whether it was perception, but again, we say even in politics, perception is everything. So it's very, very important that people have a feeling that they are actually getting a fair share. Now, ideological differences, well, the East African community, of course, at that time, again, if you are to look at aspects of Cold War and so on, and especially the way post-independent African states came into being, most of them having been colonized, say, by the British, and the kind of system and the ideologies under that, the French, and so on and so forth. And then given, of course, the other global factors that, like the Cold War, for example, there were a lot of ideological differences. Personal differences and leadership styles among the leaders of that time, for example. We are talking about Nyerere on the one hand, we are talking about Idi Amin and his, of course, military strategy to expand even to Kenya and so on and so forth. The East African community again failed at some point to remit funds and also issues of trust deficit. We can move to the next slide. Well, Tanzania at some point actually closed the border with Kenya. And remember, we are talking about shortly before the collapse of the East African community in 1977. Too much power again was placed on the heads of states in the East African community. And thank you. And this is pretty much the case even today. That one of the reasons why institutions don't work or why economic integration is likely to have a challenge despite the protocols and the regimes that are existing is largely because the African continents or countries mostly have a neo-patrimonial system of government where emphasis or the individual who is leading seem to have control over institutions. So you will have an act establishing this body and so on and so forth, but in the real sense, there are big men behind it who are actually going to call the shots. And in most cases, they will actually override the institutions. Personal ambitions and so on. Let's move to the next slide. Well, just to bring us up to speed, I've been talking about the past a lot. But when COVID came, one of the challenges we had, we had some stresses within the East African community. For example, I got this from the website of the presidency, for example, where we had the president was commenting about closing the border with Tanzania because, as we all know, Tanzania did not get a very robust protocol about the COVID. And let's move to the next slide. Well, from there, the border trade dispute started, and of course, there was a lot of disruption in terms of trade. Ideally, we are in the East African community, and perhaps we would be saying, okay, we have COVID here. How should we respond? Should we be responding across board? But what you see now is individual member states trying to protect their national interest and so on. Let's move to the next slide. Another one, you see that one again, even with Uganda, that is fairly recently, Malaba border, and so on and so forth, just because of disagreements about border protocols regarding COVID. And the question I'm posing is, even as we come towards the conclusion, is as we look forward towards a more integrated Africa, beyond the East African community, and especially looking at the African continent free trade area, for example, as an agreement that seeks to establish a common market in Africa, how we say protocols to deal with COVID. How likely are we that we are actually going to be able to successfully implement the African continent free trade area? Now, again, we are not saying it's about perfection, but in terms of that, we will need a lot of things in place. One, if you look at the conclusion now of the paper, we are saying that while legal and institutional frameworks of economic integration may be in place, it takes political leadership and goodwill for that to be implemented. Political leadership and goodwill. Now, that is very much deficient, and perhaps we shall have a short discussion about that later on. Peace, security, and stability is also very essential, of course, for economic integration. With less conflict, we are able to integrate, we're able to integrate more. So I don't know whether it is less conflict that enables integration, or it is actually integration that reduces conflict. It can go whichever way. It's a chicken-egg kind of scenario. Again, to address the question of legitimacy and political accountability of regional economic communities, there is need for states to sensitize citizens about the importance of economic integration. Now we're saying, like I mentioned before, we have a brand or a trademark like, say, Buy Kenya, Build Kenya. Well, it's more of a protectionist kind of trademark, actually, where you're encouraging people to buy locally so as to, of course, develop the economy locally, which is very good indeed. But again, if you look at, broadly speaking now, about being a member of the East African community, ideally you would be talking about, expanding and actually removing both tariff and non-tariff barriers when it comes to economic integration. So you can see, on the one hand, you want to be part of the economic and regional community, but on the other hand, you're also protecting your interests.
Poverty, it can address inequality. Of course, some of economists like myself would probably want to argue, but on average, there is evidence to that effect, okay? And this is why you see regional integration from trade perspective, from social perspective, is very critical, because there are possibilities, and politically it's a very sensitive subject, because there are possibilities of changing people's lives. And when you're touching trade, you're touching politics. Prof mentioned upheavals, and I want to reflect a few points on upheavals. And I want to reflect on what is happening right now in the world and what that means for Africa. And then I'll tie in with what would then regional economic integration mean for our countries, and what these free trade agreements mean for our countries. So I have what I call 4F. F number 1 is on food, and I want to relate this with what is happening in Russia and Ukraine, because I think this has been at the center of our discussions, and we are seeing our countries in some ways directly or indirectly being disrupted by what is happening, contagious effects that are coming from the other parts of the globe. Food is my first F. We see a lot of cry out on food prices. We have seen moves by governments in Kenya, minimum wage increased, Tanzania the same, Benin the same, Morocco the same. I have my own reservations. It's a short-term move. It doesn't have long-term impacts, but we see food cost of living has gone very, very high. Famine. Prof, you have talked of natural disasters. We see now delayed rains, climate change, and its challenges have really affected our farmers and our people what is happening in Somalia, sometimes you watch TV, you don't feel good about it, especially if you're here, you're drinking your coffee, while there are people who can't even get a glass of water. Fuel, that's my third F, fuel. We see the crisis of what is happening in Russia and Ukraine in terms of the energy prices, in terms of oil, and how that has the potential to affect our countries. And finally, the famous fertilizers in the agricultural sector, where we see fertilizers have had huge impact. Of course, prices on fertilizers started to increase way before the Ukrainian and Russian war, but now with them, the war coming on board, we have seen prices have actually went overboard. Now, a little context on the Russian-Ukrainian role in explaining what we are feeling here. First, both of them combined, they explain about 30% of global supply of wheat and barley, okay? They are combined, they are 1/5 of the global supply of maize, okay? Second, they are half of the world supply of sunflower oil. So for them to fight and close exporting, you see that has huge ramifications. And we see in the process other countries like India have also started restricting their exports. Now, what does it mean? Food prices have increased, I've said that, globally about 34% higher this year than it was last year. Crude oil have increased up by 60%, and fertilizers and gas have doubled. Now, for our economies, where we rely on intermediate goods from outside, in East Africa, for example, 30 to 33% of imports that come into the economy, into these countries, are coming from Asia, India, and a little bit of Russia. 30 to 33%. If there is global disruption, that how much can hurt us? Right now, China, because of Omicron virus, they're restricting their supply chains. We've seen America has responded by, reducing interest rates, but that has an impact on our economies. Now, what is the role of regional economic integration in that sense? And I want to now bring in the role of free trade agreements. Why should we come together as Africa? Why should we come together as countries? My colleague spoke about Buy Africa, Buy Kenya, Build Kenya. If you go to Uganda, they have Buy Uganda, Build Uganda. You go to Rwanda, Buy Rwanda, Build Rwanda. It's only Tanzania I've noted, maybe because of our humility, but very soon Mama Samia will start Buy Tanzania, Build Tanzania. But is that sustainable? I'll leave that question for you to think about. If we are thinking of regionalism, and we are still pushing for Buy Kenya, Build Kenya, Buy Tanzania, Build Tanzania, what are we exactly doing? Policymakers who are in the room, I'll leave you to think about that. But what I want to ask to reflect is, what role can regional economic integration play in addressing some of these contagious exogenous shocks that our economies are facing? How do we build on each other's comparative advantage? How do we take advantage of that? And that's the premise of the CFTA. The premise of the CFTA is to build on our Pan-Africanism. Africa has 1.3 billion people. 1.3 billion people, that's a huge market to begin with. What is enshrined in the CFTA are 2 or 3 pillars. One, to build productive capacity of our economies. We need to build productive capacities. There's no way, we become too much dependent because we don't have productive capacity. And I'll offer some solutions there. We need to build what we call regional value chains. And it's part of a little bit of productive capacity. And then socioeconomic transformation. How can we become less reliant? How can we be self-sufficient? We are 1.3 billion people. We have everything. I would say again, proudly as an African, everything. We have the manpower, we have the resources. What is lacking? Perhaps politics. I'll talk about that a little bit. But I think as a solution, we have the agreement. Some people have argued, oh, we have the agreement, but it's being financed by the West. It's an irony. You set up a big agreement and you don't have money to fund it. But we have money to go for picnics and having fun in Europe and America. Some people have argued, perhaps we need to think differently. Perhaps we need to start to reflect in our inward capacities. As countries, how do we leverage in our regional economic integration, not from papers, identifying comparative advantage for each country. I can give an example in East Africa, textile and garments. Uganda has it. Tanzania used to have it, the Ginaries in Mwanza. Rwanda, Burundi, they also. Why do we have to compete? Why can't we be complementary? Can we identify our own capacities that we have, invest on them? Right now, fertilizer, our farmers are crying out, right, because prices have gone up. But have we thought of alternative ways, organic fertilizers? Why would 1.3 billion people cry out and say, we are starving because Russia and Ukraine are fighting? 1.3 billion heads. It's unbelievable. It is unbelievable. 1.3, China is 1.6 billion, it's right to 300 million people more than us, and they self-sustain themselves. Where do you hear China when they're in trouble? Who do they call? When Americans get Katrina hurricane or whatever hits them, who do they call? Right now, what is happening in Europe, they are cutting funding to Africa. They are mobile. They are looking into their own. But when we get stuck, what do? That's a conversation for another time. So we need to strengthen our productive capacity. Look at our own comparative advantages as countries. What can we do and how can we do it? Let's strengthen regional value chains. We don't have to be vulnerable with what is happening. We can leverage on continental free trade area. We can leverage on our regional integrations to bring the best out of us. Regional value chains is the way to go. We want to industrialize Africa. We need to be able to invest in our own regional value chains. We need to think of alternative solutions. Right now we have famine, I said climate change. Are there alternative solutions? We are crying out for fuel and gas prices increasing. But Tanzania has gas. Why can't we think of alternative solution as part of broader regional economic integration? Some people are arguing now in Africa, Angola has fuel, Nigeria has fuel. Why are we even saying prices are increasing? Why can't we work with Angola to build that capacity to extract more oil for us to buy from Angola and not be vulnerable with Russia and Ukraine? The beast in the room is political economy, politics. And my colleagues have said it all. Politics can mess things up. But I always argue, I say, we identify I'm a Tanzanian, proud Kenyan, but 70 years ago, there was no border. Your grandfather, you and me are probably related. You don't know. And those days, our four grandfathers used to have many wives. This notion of having borders is coming from our colonial masters, and it has taken over our minds. We don't think as one. We think on paper. 80 years ago, there was no border. What is happening now is another form of scramble and partition of Africa. Now we have in Djibouti, Chinese and American having their military base. 1 minute, I'm concluding. In Kenya, there's a military base. It's a form, I'm not against them doing that, but it's another form of scramble and partition for Africa. We have to be careful. Regional integration and free trade agreements can work, but we have to be careful. My last point, and my Kenyan brothers and sisters, wazee na vijana, msinihukumu, I love Kenya, but I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it because I believe Kenya is a democratic country. In Tanzania, and the Magufuli, ningekuwa kidogo naogopa. But I'm going to say it because this is how Wazungu, they divide and conquer. We have set CFTA, we have signed. Kenya was the second country to sign. I was involved in developing national strategy for Kenya with the Minister of Trade here in Kenya. I know it very well. I know the implementation plan very well. But it's the same Kenya that goes and signs bilateral agreement with UK. It's the same Kenya that is going to sign bilateral agreement with US. And then you're arguing, let's have CFTA. Are you joking? How is that possible? Because the whole point of having CFTA was meant to have cohesive voice as one, a continent. Now, when you get someone to come and start dividing, you are weakening the CFTA.
Professor Iraki, you mentioned Samuel Huntington, but I just want to add here that Samuel Huntington's theory or idea that after the Cold War, conflicts or war will be fought between civilizations and culture. I think this has now been proved wrong. He recently, I think last year, he wrote an article actually revisiting that thing and admitting that you cannot wish away the state at all, because the state remains the container of all those civilizations and cultures. Civilizations or cultures cannot prosper if they are not contained within the state. But in terms of security, I think the state still remains the most relevant. Meaning that, you know, if you read, for instance, Theodore Cockburn, who reminded people in 1994, bring the state back in, because this rumor about the state eroding, that state is disappearing, has now been proved wrong. Therefore, in order for regional integration, economically, politically, socially, and security-wise, take root in East Africa, we must build and strengthen the state. Because when you talk about lack of political will comes from the state. So weak states in East African area, in the EAC area of jurisdiction, is also one impediment. Then also admission of Somalia. I think Professor Iraki, you rightfully asked whether Somalia should be admitted into the EAC. Now, regional integration always rests on the idea that you have a physical region. You look at the region and the physical region and the functional region, then you collapse the physical and the functional together. Now, a physical region, that is, you would want East African community to produce a physical region within East Africa. Physical region here means that the states themselves, that there's a geographical area, there's a territory. Then functional is now where you have people interaction, cultural, technical, economic, and others. So that admission of Somalia into East African community would be more helpful, particularly in terms of creating a physical region, mostly because of political and security issues. So whereas Somalia may not have very great economic potential like DRC, but admission of Somalia, I would actually say, will help to neuter the Somali nationalism, which someone talked about here yesterday. The Greater Somalia concept. I've realized that in all conferences where we are discussing East Africa, some people who also know but deliberately ignore the fact that in 1963, when Somalia was getting independence, the Egal Shamake regime declared their major mission was to build a greater Somalia based on those Somali regions which were apportioned to other areas like Djibouti, northern frontier of Kenya and others. So I would say yes, it is important that we admit Somalia, because when Somalia becomes East Africa physically, then the aspirations for a greater Somalia, which led to Ethiopia's Somalia war. And remember, all successive Somali governments have not repudiated that greater Somalia concept. Therefore, in terms of security, it would work very well. Now, I don't want to take a lot of time, but for Kirui, for Dr. Kirui, I just want to mention earlier that conflicts are not necessarily an impediment for regional integration. Actually, the more you integrate, the more conflicts are generated, because you are bringing in more participants, countries complaining that imports and import duties and what is needed, particularly in East Africa, is an ill-built conflict resolution and management mechanism within the EAC, a collective conflict resolution and management infrastructure, so that you don't have Muhosi, the son of President Museveni, to visit his so-called uncle in Rwanda for the Gatune border, which had been closed for almost 3 years, to be opened, so that you don't rely on personal aspirations. So what we need is we should build collective regional conflict resolution and management mechanisms.
So proxy war means you use the little one to fight your war. You use Ukraine to fight Russia. Here's my point. The Africans are trading at 15% right now. Can correct me. Asians are Europe are trading with each other at 70%. And Asia is over 50%. Now, if we hang on this theory that Africa unite, Kwame Nkrumah, Jamal Abdel Nasser, all those guys who were gone. It's like Karl Marx and the idea of we all give to each other, we all work together, we all love each other. We are in a different world and are becoming much more a realist. And I'm saying, yes, Kenya ought to be able to find a country, a bilateral or a multilateral, for the benefit of Kenya. And here's the reason why I'm saying, if we're not prepared militarily, then you will see what can happen to all the work we have done. And so we have to be prepared to link with the most powerful country or otherwise so that we can benefit. And I want to give example of Israel. I also want to give example of South Korea. I want to give example of Taiwan. And I want to give example of Singapore. Those are independent nation states who went out and created both bilateral and multilateral relationship for the benefit of their country. And their benefit increased. So, yes, we need to trade more with Tanzania. Is that happening? No. What are the issues? So my point is not to go to this grandiose idea of United States of Africa, but create regions that work and concentrate on the regional bloc. And I'm
centers, not political centers, but you have made them really political centers. So if we can have more trade among the counties, they can find out what is their comparative advantage. Then with the time, they can now scale that to the global level. So that if we find that a county like Kitui is very good in producing green glams, it can trade with other counties. Then they can scale that and start exporting their green glams or whichever area they are good at. So I want our counties to be seed beds of globalization, seedbeds of international trade. I think Prof has confirmed that Samuel Huntington was wrong, and that is the risk we run as scorers. We make predictions, but we are not prophets. So time will always tell us whether we are right or wrong. The state has come back. If you have been very keen, my prof, COVID brought back the state. In fact, one of the biggest beneficiaries of COVID, apart from IT sector, is the government. The government was able to crawl back a lot of power, and I can assure you, just because COVID is going, does not mean the state is going to lose that power. So the state is back, but we're hoping it's going to put that power into good use. I also believe that integration should be more mental than physical. And I think that's a problem we have with integration. We can have open borders, but our people mentally are tuned to integration. If you go to the US, it's a very diverse country, but they think like Americans. Same with Canada, same with China, and so on. So if we don't look at integration from a mental perspective, the physical perspective will not work. After all, there are a lot of you here who have never been to Tanzania, who have not been to Rwanda. And I hope you are aware that if you want to go to Rwanda, you just need your national ID. You don't even need a passport, but we don't go there. So we must see it as mental. Finally, I think my prof again agreed with me that Somali should join the East African community. And personally, I would be very happy to own
about the East Africa community. It has institutions, it has structures, it has 22 years of work behind it. And it certainly, in my view, will still be here 50 years from now. I'm not too sure about African Continental Free Trade Area, to be honest. So that's a first. The second is, I don't know whether it's true that in Kenya or in East Africa or in Africa generally, the state has been absent. If you have an economy of 118 billion and a government spending 36 billion, basically 1/4 of the gross domestic product, that's not an absent government. Maybe how it's arranged itself or what it's doing. 1 million workers work for the state in Kenya, so I'm not too sure that the state is absent. And maybe we should count our blessings for the fact that regardless of the dysfunctions that we see, the state in Kenya is present, at least it's spending our money, so we can just simply direct them to spend better. And thirdly, I think my colleagues have confirmed that the very function of institutions and regional integration is not so that those political and cultural tensions disappear, but that there'll be formal institutions and mechanisms for their resolution. And that's what human growth has been about for the 10,000 years or so that we've been here. So I'm grateful that we've had a question about integration. I think regional economic integration has more benefits to society than just the exchange of goods and services. Its institutional strengths, foundations, and how it strengthens society to go forward is perhaps one of the reasons we are still here, and I'm thankful to GLOCEPS for having this session as the penultimate session. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like you to clap for my 3 colleagues.
Yes, Professor Iraki, please. Thank you very much, Prof. Yes, Dr. Kirui, please. Thank you very much. Our Executive Director, please, for Dr. Mvienga. Yes, Ambassador, not yet. Yes, for, yeah, we are issuing this for Dr. Vienga to be given to him at an appropriate time.
That what we have done for the last 2 days is the merit and stability of the region. The speakers broadly emphasized that Africa cannot solely rely on external actors to bring stability to the region as they have vested interests. Ideological differences, religious divisions, and competition between receding great powers, that is the US, UK, China, Russia, and emerging powers such as Turkey, UAE, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. Thus, the Eastern African region has become a playfield of geopolitical parties, where they are funding infrastructure, elections, extracting resources, and in worst-case scenarios, fueling violence. On Ethiopia and Somalia, the panelists deliberated on the historicity of the conflicts which have connections to colonial policies, culture, class, and struggle for nationhood and statehood. The speakers also flagged out that globally, democracy is in recession or even dead, and its place, populism and nationalism is taking root. In the Eastern African region, the decline of democracy is destabilizing governance structures, as in the case of Ethiopia and Somalia. Banning autocrats want to replace federalism with centralism. Subsequently, the panelists concluded that there is need to strategize on how to consolidate stabilization of the region. Key recommendations: there is need for African funding for African solutions to African problems. We must first silence the guns for us to pursue lasting peace and deal with the structural violence. There is need to consolidate African transition missions in Somalia for state stabilization in Somalia. Conflict dynamics session. The second theme of the conference examined conflict dynamics in Eastern Africa. Presentations focused on gender and peace building in Eastern Africa. The first paper underscored the participation and meaningful involvement of women in peace building. The second paper mapped the trends of violent extremism in Eastern Africa. It identified, among others, the growing threat of cross-border violent extremist threats. This paper further praised the existing measures to counter violent extremism. It recommended the whole of society approach in countering violent extremism, in part using both hard and soft power. The third paper examined the climate change and water conflicts in Southern Africa. It made a case of how climate change was contributing to water conflicts in the region. It recommended the need for climate change adaptation and the prudent use of water resources. Each of the papers contextualized the conflicts and gave several recommendations. Key among them were: there is need for more gender inclusivity in peace building and peace support operations. There is need to embrace African-centric conflict management models. There is need to implement the whole of society approach in countering violent extremism. There is need to program for climate change adaptation. Governance dynamics session. This theme focused on social, this one is a little bit very. This theme focused on societal democracy, elections management, and peace support operations in the region. The panelists emphasized that poorly managed elections have negative spillover effects on state security, capital flight, and decline in productivity. This is fueled by the lack of transparency and accountability in the public service, and mega corruption that is perpetuating illicit financing during election campaigns. Concerns were equally raised on inadequate involvement of observer mission in electoral management in Eastern Africa, which is detrimental to regional stability. On associational democracy and power sharing, it was observed that the elites have hijacked the process, and this is contributing to political crisis in Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Somalia, considering that even the definition of minority and majority communities is even changing. It was observed that states are not supportive of the global initiatives, particularly in peace support operations. It concluded that peace continues to be elusive, hence the need to consolidate the governance system in Eastern Africa, as the region is consuming most of global resources in peace support operations. Recommendations. There is need for national assemblies in respective countries in the region to review the definition of governance enshrined in specific constitutions and conceptualize it to the country's specific realities. The election observation missions should plan election monitoring activities early enough in tandem with a country's specific electoral calendar of activities. The electoral management bodies in respective countries should tighten enforcement and compliance with campaign financing laws, strictly enforce compliance during the campaign period to curb the cost of election campaigns and money laundering activities. Intensify efforts of improving public trust to increase public confidence in the expectations of electoral outcomes. There is need for African stakeholders to design a common military doctrine for peace support operations in Africa. Transnational Organized Crimes Session. This session focused on the emerging issues in transnational organized crimes. The panelists noted there is lack of appreciation of the nexus between security and development, and this continues to enable the proliferation of small arms and light weapons and counter violent extremism. Despite the abundance of laws designed to combat organized crimes, governments in East Africa remain marginally successful in controlling transnational organized crimes. The region continues to suffer from weak rules of law in a majority of the states, incapacitated national coordination, and poor capacity for regional cooperation among regional organs. This in turn hinders effective border control, creating permissiveness for illicit trade and finances. However, the bigger picture lies in the political will of the governments in the region. It is not ignorant. The influence of politically linked figures in the perpetration of organized crimes in the Eastern Africa. Subsequently, there is unpredictable selective funding for the institutions starts with the fight against organized crimes. This has created the right environment for reactive rather than proactive measures against organized crime in the region. Recommendations. There is need to share information and activate cooperation channels among regional organs engaging in the control of organized crime. There is need to harmonize national policies within the region, particularly on anti-money laundering laws, as a means to counter terrorism financing. This should also speak to the regulation of cryptocurrency, that's digital financing, as a means to control illicit financial flows into the region. There is need to mitigate. There is need to migrate to more society-centric solutions that focus more on psychosocial rehabilitation. There is need to enhance public education and awareness among communities and political class on the ownership of the small arms and light weapons. There is need to facilitate weapons surrender programs that guarantee protection from global. Regional economic integration. The discourses on regional economic integration in the age of free trade agreements draws lessons from upheavals in the national and global sphere, historical perspectives and lessons. These perspectives have social and economic consequences that affect the performance of economies and the welfare of communities. Some of the key issues noted are that states that are in trade with each other are less likely to engage in actual conflict. Equally, the addressing of historical challenges, differences in culture, orientations, and personal characteristics of leaders are directly linked to the success of past, present, and future economic integration initiatives in the East African regional states. Recommendations. There is need to explore questions on the strengthening of political, judicial, and economic institutions and systems that trace economic integration initiatives. There is need to address barriers to enhancement of intra-Africa and regional trade development and peace initiatives. There is need to advance the question of competitive advantages between member states compared to inherent orientations and initiatives like Buy Kenya, Build Kenya. There is need to strengthen research and mechanisms that are supportive of production and supply chain capabilities in the East African region.
This opportunity to invite our retired Inspector General of this Cabinet, who is with us again, to make some brief remarks. I have to confess that if you look at the GLOCEPS keenly, you will see the fingerprints of a retired Inspector General somewhere. But that is a story for another day. Welcome.
Also, I thought you just mentioned that it had something to do with the setting up of this institution. But as I said, that's a story for another day. So I must say, in the first instance, I'm deeply honored. I'm very, very gratified to have been invited to participate in this inaugural GLOCEPS conference that brought together those of us in this country interested in national security issues, in the academia, those who belong to the think tanks, and practitioners. Although not all of them that if I was the one doing so, I would have been happy to see. It would have been a wider pool of invitees from the practitioners' standpoint, so that we have more who are still serving, and perhaps even more who are retired, so that we can engage more. But nevertheless, allow me to say one or two things. I'd like to say, number one, that I truly loved the setting up of this institution. It is an idea whose time had come. And I'm not aware, if any, that we have an institution of this type in this country that brings together this extremely important pool of talent or national security issues from the practitioners' angle, the academic angle, as well as the think tank. So this is an idea whose time had come, and I want to laud from the very bottom of my heart, or my own heart, those who participated in setting it up. Secondly, it has given me another opportunity to interact with the persons who have interacted with this matter of national security, that include Dr. Kabage, Dr. Asembo, those in academia who have also interacted with those of us in the practitioner side, who include Professor Nyuro and Professor Mashaga and Professor Midamba, to these position whereby we are able to interact freely and share ideas. Secondly, it has also given me the opportunity of meeting Professor Joachim. I've never met before, but I love reading his articles in newspapers because they make you think. And it also lets you know the beauty and the majesty of this country called Kenya. Few of us really know that we have a great country, and I really like what you pen in your articles, just letting us know that we have a jewel in our hands, and we should not mess with it, like we often try to do. Because we mess with it, we have nowhere else to go. And I pray and believe that people listen and read what you write, and pay heed to what you do. There's something that you said here that struck me, because I did make that attempt a little while ago, in which you said we need to think of making our counties centers of some economic activity from a competitive advantage point, so that Kitui can sell to Turkana, and Turkana can sell to Kericho, and Kericho can sell to Marsabit. Let me think broader than that, but we start local before we go beyond that. I tried to do that, and I'm sorry it didn't work out well. But I'll give it another think, maybe another day. But that's a story for another day as well. Number 3, I want to say that the conference brought these great minds together so that we can interrogate these national security issues from the widest angle as a conference communique, as it has been told by Mr. Otieno, that makes us think and look for solutions that we can prescribe to policymakers to find solutions to problems that begin with this country. So we look forward to seeing many more of these conferences. And I have no doubt in my mind that we have the capability and the capacity to organize more going forward. Finally, from a personal perspective, what should these institutions look for to becoming in the days ahead? I'll be very, very happy if in the coming years, when the days ahead, we will have our own version of Brookings institution in GLOCEPS. We have our own version of the Center for Foreign Relations in GLOCEPS. Those are US institutions. We have our own Chatham House, the famed British institution in GLOCEPS. We have our own famed Law Institute in Australia in GLOCEPS. So going forward, GLOCEPS and conquer the world. It's all available, it's yours. You have all these great minds. And I have no doubt in my mind that you're quite capable of becoming exactly that.
Lieutenant General retired Lazaro Subeyosa, former IG, National Police Service, Mr. Joseph Boynet, and thank you for gracing our event today. Representatives of the Embassy of Qatar, led by Mr. Abdigadir Fedemuna, please welcome, sir. Ambassador Galang Dean, former ambassador of South Sudan to Washington, here in his private capacity, please welcome, sir. Members of GLOCEPS board, our associates led by Professor Noah Midava, our distinguished invited guests, GLOCEPS team, and our non-resident fellows, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Good afternoon once again. On behalf of GLOCEPS fraternity, allow me to start my remarks this afternoon by thanking you all most sincerely for the support that you have individually and collectively accorded to us during the last 2 days of our inaugural conference focused on regional peace and security in Eastern Africa. It was such a great time for us to just sit and see you meticulously executing the various roles that we entrusted to you as moderators, as presenters, as subject matter experts, and even as administrators, my team. It was very gratifying. I was just sitting and everything was working. I want to thank you so much for that. This has made this conference a great success. Allow me to sincerely thank our chief guest, who was here with us most of the day yesterday, Ambassador Engineer Mahbub Mali Mohammed. Listening to him yesterday was such an inspiration, and his kind words about this center were quite motivating. I also wish to acknowledge our chief guest today, Lieutenant General retired Lazaro Suleiman. Sir, we appreciate that you created time from your busy schedule to be with us for the entire period of the conference. We had invited you to come for the closing ceremony, but you said you'll attend the entire conference. On behalf of the GLOCEPS family, kindly receive our sincere gratitude. Thank you so much, sir. I also wish to sincerely thank all the presenters, all the moderators, all the subject matter experts for a job well done. You made everything seem so simple, yet we know it was at a great sacrifice on your side. Moving forward, the center will still be reaching out to you to share your refined ideas and publications. Our intention is that the rich materials and ideas we shared in this conference will be packaged and disseminated for the furtherance of research and discourses in peace, governance, security, and development. For this reason, we will still be reaching out to you for your feedback and opportunities for partnerships. It is my sincere hope that you will continue to welcome us again into your spaces and into your organizations. To the participants, you made our day. You honored our invitations. We would not have had a conference without you. We appreciate your time, the new ideas you shared with us during the various interactions, and more importantly, the professionalism you exhibited during the entire conference period. To you all, asante sana for walking this journey with us. As I explained yesterday during my welcoming remarks, the outcomes of this conference will assist GLOCEPS to develop advisory opinions to policymakers across the region and beyond. Within our mandate of contributing to global peace and prosperity, it will further assist us to harvest new ideas that will promote our policy research agenda, while also enabling us to identify topical issues that we may need to prioritize for further research. As we come to the end of the conference, we have gained a lot of new ideas from the various presentations and interactions, especially during the Q&A sessions. These ideas offer potential areas of future research and collaboration, and we will pursue those. To this end, and to give a snippet of some of them, I want you to remember Ms. Ikran. She gave us critical future research areas on understanding the emerging threats and patterns of Gulf states in the Horn of Africa, and the peace and security implications for the region. On the other side, remember Dr. Sitawa in his presentations. He posed a number of questions, like how can we achieve a common military doctrine in peace support operations in Somalia, while training of the Somali National Forces is so disjointed and conducted by different entities. He gave an example of a situation where 7,000 security personnel have been trained in Eritrea, another 2,000 trained by clan militias, others in Djibouti, others by Turkey, others in Uganda, others in Kenya, Ethiopia, and so on. To make it worse, he observed that for Eritrea, the training was clandestine, which had implications for regional security. So, do we really expect stability in that country soon? Should the African Union Transitional Mission in Somalia, ATMIS, be handing over security responsibilities to the Somali National Army in the next 2 years, as envisaged by United Nations and the African Union? These are some of the questions from the presentation that we may need to interrogate moving forward. Another example emanated from a side chat with Professor Fatuma Ali, our first moderator, yesterday. She was concerned with the fact that we did not feature a topic on Eastern Africa labor exports to the Gulf. She raised concerns about what Eastern Africa states are doing to ensure our people are not suffering in the Gulf. This is because we not only need to offload and commercialize the excess labor that we have, but we also need to work together to protect our people. Observing that the region was among the youngest population in the world, she opined that this is a strategic resource that we must leverage when engaging at a global level. I am pleased that today we have a representative from the Embassy of Qatar in this room. We are saying we want to understand and further research on how to better engage with the Gulf Cooperation Council states on how to improve our people-to-people relations for the benefit of our states and particularly the Eastern Africa region. Other issues that popped up during discussions were about culture, the issue of funding of peace support operations, the limited funding of purported African solutions, the limited social capital and the peripheral location that women still occupy in decision-making on matters of peace and security, despite UN Resolution 1325 having been adopted in the year 2000. These are issues that need further research, and I encourage all stakeholders, think tanks, here present, and missions to engage and collaborate with us as we find sustainable solutions to some of these issues. As a way forward, GLOCEPS will endeavor to attain the go-to think tank. So IG, rest assured, we are coming. We will invest our efforts and resources to this regard, and we will make this conference an annual event. It is already anchored in our current strategic plan 2022-2027. We take note of the proposal by Professor Kagwanja. He advised us to borrow from the Munich Security Conference, and he even said we need to come up with a Nairobi Security Conference. This is an annual conference that has been held since 1963 in Munich, Germany. It has been bringing together statesmen, experts, and servicemen from around the world to discuss current and future security challenges. GLOCEPS, as an African-led global think tank, will continue to provide a platform where policy influence outcomes are initiated and long-lasting networks are established. To this, we are open to working with current and future partnerships. Ladies and gentlemen, if you do not take anything else from this conference, please appreciate the networks that you have made during the 2 days here. Such networks will come in handy one of these days. Finally, and as we depart, I wish you all journey masses and safe travels. When you get to your countries, for those who are from outside Kenya, and to your institutions, for those who are from Kenya, do kindly pass our best regards from GLOCEPS. At this juncture, allow me to briefly introduce our chief guest today, Lieutenant General Retired Lazaro Subego. He is an accomplished officer and gentleman who served the Kenya Defense Forces most of his life. He rose in rank to become the Kenya Army Commander in the year 2000, the hallmark of military service, undertaken with honor, passion, professionalism, and great distinction. Here, he distinguished himself through a concept he came up with known as the zero tolerance policy. And I'm amazed that Brigadier General Mohammed yesterday asked why we still perpetuate corruption. You have the answer. General Subeyo provided the answer a long time ago. You just need to make sure that you enforce the rules that are there. And that is what he did when he became the Army Commander. If you misused public resources, you are gone. Zero tolerance. That is it. That is the answer. Brigadier Mohammed, if you have forgotten.
Thank you.
Thank you. He later proudly retired in the year 2003 to devote himself full-time to completing the Sudan peace process as the chief mediator, which culminated with the signing of the comprehensive peace agreement on the 9th of January 2005. Congratulations, sir. You have mentored a lot of us. We are still proud of you. And God bless you and keep you long.
For bringing yourselves to our level so that we can learn from you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor to have been invited to deliver closing address in this conference. Allow me to thank the executive team at GLOCEPS for the consideration. For the past 2 days, the conference has deliberated on changing peace and security dynamics in the region. I have been privileged to listen to the 5 key themes of the conference. The conference has deliberated on varied peace and security dynamics in the East African region. Indeed, the region is characterized by intrastate conflict, fragile peace environment, and human security threats such as drought, locust infestation, and related effects of climate change, the problem of refugees, internal displaced persons, and violent extremism. Peace remains a prized possession that all humanity must collectively pursue. Kenya, and indeed regional organizations such as IS, is relevant in the context of reflecting Agenda 2063, the Continental Blueprint, alongside the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, aspirations for peace, security, and stability. In my closing address, I would like to draw on my own experience in the Sudan peace process and offer some reflections aligned to conflict management in the region. I shall rely on our experience of mediating the Sudanese peace process that culminated, as been said here, with the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement, the CPA, in 9 January 2005.
one of the outcomes of the CBA was the independence of South Sudan. You can hear, you heard that there is an ambassador being here who was the ambassador of South Sudan in Washington. I will spare you the details and instead highlight some lessons that could be relevant in this conference. One is that these processes are long-term. Therefore, patience and resilience are important. In the Sudan peace process, our mediation under the auspices of IGAD appreciated that peace processes are long-term and gradual. Moreover, it requires clear framing of issues to be discussed beforehand. The latter is a good mediation model. The Declaration of Principles, DOPs, was the diagnosis of the conflict, and that was the starting point. Second, the ability to win the trust of multiple conflict actors is critical in mediation processes. There is need to build synergies and partnerships with multiple local and regional international partners for technical and financial support. The new and emerging conflict dynamics that occur during negotiations necessitate an honest demonstration of trust. This is due to the competing interests, which include geopolitical influences and which come with acceptability of non-partisan mediation. Third, mediation requires both logistics and technical expertise, and indeed the contributions of think tanks and academic experts. In the Sudan peace process, I engaged nearly every sector. If it was discussing oil, we got somebody from a country that had oil, how to share oil. If it was land, we got professors from the University of Nairobi who dealt with the land, as it were, the historical land, and so forth. And so experts in every area. I can mention today that we even employed some unorthodox ways of getting information of how the people of Sudan in the north were feeling and how the people of South Sudan were feeling and what was the end result. Fourth, mediation needs to also consider the aftermath. When we consider the comprehensive peace agreement of 2005 that led to the birth of South Sudan, we noticed that we did not put in place measures that would guide the young state to actualize the fruits of independence. We were not successful in the Sudan peace process in Addis Ababa because the mediation team was not on the same page. Regrettably, the current status of implementation of the revitalized agreement for the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan continues to experience delays. As a way forward, let me reflect on strategies that think tanks like GLOCEPS, research institutes, academics, and policymakers can invest in the pursuit of global peace and prosperity with a focus on Eastern African region. The following are my thoughts, and are in line with that pursuit. We need to appreciate the value of academic and applied research in order to unravel the root causes and changing conflict dynamics in the region. For the past 2 days, we have deliberated on several peace and conflict dynamics in the region. These include the Tigray crisis, the Somali state stabilization process, strengthening peace support operations, inclusive politics, and democratization challenges. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of women in peace and security, and youth in peace and security too. These are the biggest losers in conflict situations. The importance of research in these scenarios cannot be understated, as it is critical in arriving at a fair assessment of conflict situations before offering conflict management interventions. We need to recognize the significance of documentation. It is important every so often to document our peace building or state stabilization interventions for the sake of our history and our future generations. These days, there are calls to decolonize knowledge, and therefore the need for Africa-centric debates and perspectives on what works and does not work in peace stabilization interventions. Given the academic and the policy expertise in this room, there is need to archive our multiple knowledge and contribute to scholarly and policy debates on building peace in our region. We need to reflect in a comparative lens on some of the good practices of peace building and stabilization interventions, drawing from local, regional, and global experiences. This would be in the form of seminars, academic conferences, and publications. Let me conclude once again by thanking the Executive Director GLOCEPS and his team for putting together such an intellectually engaging conference. I hope the insights gained here shall be used for policy and opening new research frontiers in the peace and security framework. With those few remarks, or many remarks, I wish to now officially close this conference. May God bless you.